All right, this is an important transition in Module 3 because, as you see in the title, we're now going to be talking about the Export Administration Regulations. You'll note in our first bullet point that the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations, are implemented by the U.S. Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS as it's called. So this is one of the first differences that we see from ITAR, which of course is controlled by the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls under the Department of State. The Export Administration Regulations are found in 15 CFR and run through parts 730 to 774. Second bullet point, BIS's legislative authority is based on two things really. The Export Administration Act of 1979, the EAA as amended, and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or the EEPA. We have two websites here, which of course are found in our appendix as well, the actual general EAR website, as well as to the link in our last bullet point to the EAR via eCFR. Good resource tools there. So let's talk a little bit about the scope of the Export Administration Regulations, the EAR, as we'll call it from this point moving forward. Well, in general terms, the EAR covers any item that is not exclusively controlled for export, re-export, or transfer by another government agency of the United States government, the USG. So this is really a roundabout way of saying that anything that doesn't fall under ITAR or other agencies, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, really falls under the auspices of EAR. Again, the Bureau of Industry and Security through the Department of Commerce. In our second bullet point, and this is quite significant, we'll state that the particular focus of EAR is on controlling dual-use items. And as the name would indicate, a dual-use item has more than one application, more than one use. This is particularly significant because BIS is interested in looking at products or items that have a commercial application, but that could also potentially have a military or a proliferation or a WMD application. So this whole idea of dual-use items will transcend the entire discussion on EAR. Another thing that the EAR does in our last bullet point here is to implement what are known as anti-boycott law provisions. This deals mainly with anti-boycott language found in international trade, particularly against the state of Israel, something that we'll talk about at the very end of this particular module. As you can see in our title, we're going to talk about what some of the differences are between the EAR and the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, and they are significant. So the first point to be made is that unlike ITAR, there is no registration required. You'll recall from our previous discussion on ITAR that a company that is dealing in products or technology found on the USML, whether they export or not, they have to register with the Department of State, the DDTC. That's not the case here under the EAR, so there's no registration required. There are two specific tools that are used for determining levels of control and license authorizations, and they are the Commerce Control List, the CCL as it's sometimes referred to, and the Commerce Country Chart, or more simply, the Country Chart. We'll be going into great details about these tools, but they are especially important to how we use the EAR to determine the level of authorization that we as an exporter may need from BIS. License authorizations are influenced by a couple of things, and we're on our third bullet point here. They are end use and end user considerations. This takes us back right away to the previous mention of dual use items. So BIS is especially concerned about what the potential end use is of a product or a technology, or who the end users are. So it's a what and a who consideration. Another difference between EAR and ITAR, second to the last bullet point, is that EAR tells us specifically what are referred to as reasons for control. We have a whole slide and many references to reasons for control, but the EAR does explicitly list why a given product going to a particular country for a particular use, what the reason for control might be. The last bullet point, and this is a substantial difference as well between EAR and ITAR, is that there are a variety of license exceptions available under the Export Administration Regulations. You will also recall from ITAR that we stated pretty much if your product shows up on the USML, you need a license. Well, that's not the case under EAR. There are a variety of exceptions based on the type of product, technological capabilities, where it's going, who it's going to, who it's going to be used by, that you can get an authorization known as a license exception. We're going to go through each and every one of those as well. We'll be making reference to the BIS website on a number of occasions, but this is what the landing page, the home page, looks like, and of course the link in the title. But as you can see, and we'll go into greater detail, we'll dig into different landing pages and such, but starting on the left-hand side, the home page, some information about BIS, the Export Administration regulations themselves, licensing considerations, enforcement, a very nice section on compliance and training, additional programs, reform, that's the Export Control Reform Initiative, more detail on that, and some statistics as well. But again, we'll be coming back to this on a number of occasions. In fact, the next slide gives us a little more detail right now. This is the EAR landing page, the actual Export Administration regulations. We won't be going into too much detail on this right now, but as a resource, pretty special place to know how to get to as you're dealing with Export Administration regulation details. And as you can see, on the left-hand side, there are the regs themselves, details on that Commerce Control List that we briefly mentioned a moment ago, the Commerce Country Chart, Federal Register notices, just lots of details and great resources to use. In the center of the page, and what we're trying to illustrate for now, is the actual Export Administration regulations in a downloadable file. Again, we'll be going through significant detail, considerable detail on the EAR itself, so not to worry, but as you can see, and this is a partial listing of that page, we have a table of contents, Commerce Control List Index, and then different categories. We're going to explain what those categories mean in just a little while, so don't get too concerned about that just yet. But another good landing resource for your use. One of the best tools that BIS has put out is what's called an exporter portal. You can see the link on the right-hand side. This is fairly recent, but an excellent tool that takes you to a whole new level of details by subject. And we'll run through some of them here. Again, we will be making reference to these throughout the balance of the material on EAR. But export control basics, one of my favorites, and we'll get into this when we talk about sanctions, different lists to check, prohibited exports to certain parties and such, decision tree tools that we talked a little bit about during the ITAR section, SnapR login, that's the online license application tool. We'll be speaking about that shortly. There's online training capabilities, special countries to be concerned with, the EAR itself, best practices, on and on and on. We will be making use of this in considerable detail, but an excellent tool, an excellent resource to have knowledge of. So now we're going to talk about a term that will come up frequently, and that is, what does subject to the EAR mean? You'll hear this a lot as we go through the various material. Well, the proper terminology for items that fall under the EAR is subject to the EAR. And as we said, if you want to invert this definition, if something is subject to the EAR, it pretty much means that it's not under ITAR or some other government agency. The vast majority of exports, re-exports, and transfers from the United States are subject to the EAR. So some items and activities over which BIS exercises its jurisdiction, and you'll see that it's an all-encompassing approach. First sub-bullet point, well, items in the U.S., so anything in the United States, including in a foreign trade zone or moving in transit through the U.S. from one foreign country to another. All of that, if it's not under ITAR or another agency, is subject to the EAR. Second sub-bullet point, U.S. origin items wherever located. So it's not just EAR subject items in the United States, but U.S. origin items wherever they are overseas. Third sub-bullet point, items produced abroad using U.S. origin content or technology. And then the final sub-bullet point, any specific conduct of U.S. and foreign persons, particularly as it relates to proliferation activities. So it's the conduct of people, U.S. citizens and foreign persons, that are subject to the EAR as well. Continuing on with this theme, what does subject to the EAR mean? Important to point out, subject to the EAR does not necessarily mean that a license is required. It does mean, however, that the export or re-export of an item requires an authorization, an important term that we'll be using throughout our discussion. And an authorization, as you'll note in our third bullet point, can come in several forms. Well, that authorization could be an export license from BIS. A given product going to a specific country for a specific use requires a license. That's an authorization. Maybe under certain circumstances, an item is controlled by BIS, but there is a license exception. That's also known as an authorization. And then, in many, many, many cases, no license is required because the nature of the technology, the end use, the end user, etc., does not require a license under BIS authority. So NLR, as it's called, is more frequent for items subject to the EAR than are an export license requirement or a license exception. Items that are not subject to the EAR. Well, anything publicly available as a technology or a software, I like to call it myself the Best Buy test, which means you can walk into a Best Buy and acquire that technology or software. Now, that's not a legal criteria, but it's publicly available technology or software. Also, certain published information, brochures, companies even that sell controlled products have to be able to market and brand their products. So certain published information that doesn't reveal technological specifications and such, a simple brochure, a website that doesn't go into a lot of technical detail, fall under this certain published information category. We've mentioned this a couple of times, but the third bullet point worth re-mentioning, items not subject to the EAR are items that are controlled for export or re-export by other U.S. government agencies. We already talked about the Department of State, Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, but there are others. You'll see in our second sub-bullet point, the Department of Defense and Department of State specific to foreign military sales. We talked about that during our ITAR section. Department of Energy, Office of Foreign Asset Controls. So if an item is not subject to the EAR, it's either publicly available technology or software, certain published information, or, very simply, items that are controlled by other government agencies. Continuing on with these other government agencies, we already mentioned the Department of Energy, but also the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the Patent and Trademark Office. An important trade tip here to mention is that there are certain instances, depending on a product and its capabilities and where it's going and its uses and such, where regulations may overlap, meaning ITAR, EAR, OFAC, these regs could overlap with one another. In those cases, an exporter may have to review the regulations of more than one agency when making license determinations, and even contact a given agency for clarification. Let's transition into a new topic, of which we've spoken a little bit, but let's go into more detail, and that is the drivers of an export license authorization. Remember what we said the meaning of an authorization was: an actual license approval, a license exception, or NLR. But basically, the whole rationale behind BIS controls revolves around the answers to these four basic license requirement questions, all related to this theme of dual use. What is the item being exported or re-exported? Number two, what is the country of ultimate destination for an export or re-export? Who is the ultimate end user of the item? And what is the ultimate end use of the item? Remember, always be thinking in terms of dual use items. Reasons for control under EAR. And this is the first specific reference that we'll make to the EAR. That's part 738.2. There are a number of reasons why a specific item, technology, software, etc., is controlled. And when we say controlled, we mean we don't want it to get into the wrong hands for the wrong uses. Each reason for control, and we'll go through a bunch of examples on this, are denoted by an uppercase two-letter acronym. Let's read through them in the spirit of being thorough. AT, anti-terrorism, CB, chemical and biological weapons, CC, crime control, CW, chemical weapons convention, EI, encryption items, firearms convention, FC, missile technology, MT, moving over to the right-hand side, our national security, or NS, nuclear non-proliferation, NP, RS, regional stability, meaning regions around the world, short supply, SS, particular items that, as the name would indicate, are in short supply and we have to control. A United Nations embargo. The U.S.'s involvement in a United Nations embargo would fall under UN. Significant items, SI, and SL, surreptitious listening. We'll see examples of most, if not all of these as we proceed, but we want to get it out there what the reasons for control are as explicitly stated in EAR 738.2. We're going to stop here and wrap up section 14 and pick up section 15 in just a few minutes. See you soon.